A 24-year-old man from Algeria who was in prison in Wandsworth, an asylum seeker, has been mistakenly released from prison in London. This is just a short time after a man called Hadush Kebatu was wrongly freed. You remember, he was in the Bell Hotel in Epping and was in prison in Essex and was mistakenly released. He's now been deported back to Ethiopia. This whole question was raised in the House of Commons as to whether there were other asylum seekers who'd either escaped or been wrongly released from prison. And the Deputy Prime Minister, David Lammy, in for Keir Starmer, didn't really answer the question, pointing to a review by Dame Lynn Owens being underway as to what happened and whether it had happened before or since. Well, it has. Henry Riley is here to tell us the detail, and we'll hear from Natasha, LBC's political editor, in just a second about the political implications of all of this, for there are many. Henry, what do we know so far?
What we know, and it's all still emerging at this time, but I think the crucial thing is the gap, the sheer length of time that took place between this individual, the 24-year-old Algerian man, we don't know his name yet, being released from Wandsworth prison and when the Metropolitan Police found out. So this individual was released from Wandsworth on Wednesday, the 29th of October. And it was only yesterday at around 1 o'clock, shortly after 1, that the Met Police was informed that this individual had been released in error. Now, of course, HMP Wandsworth, we've spoken about the number of people who've been released in error, 262 instances between March 24 and March 2025. This individual released in error. There's now a manhunt underway, but that was the prison, of course, that Daniel Khalif, you'll recall, last year was actually absconded. So slightly different, but nonetheless there were question marks at the time about the practices there.
And there's
at
been a
Wandsworth.
Documentary, hasn't there, as well, made into exactly what's going on at Wandsworth Prison in terms of standards. Can I just correct something I said? It isn't established with certainty yet that this is an asylum seeker, this 24-year-old.
That's right. It has been reported in some places, but from what we've heard from the Metropolitan Police and the Ministry of Justice, that hasn't been confirmed yet. All we know is that this individual is a foreign national. But really where we are now is a Metropolitan Police who seemingly were told only yesterday, nearly a week after this individual was released in error. Officers are carrying out urgent inquiries to locate him, to return him to custody. And, of course, all of this has been raised because of the mistaken release of Hadush Kebatu, the sex offender who was released in error from Chelmsford prison. In that case, it was across 3 days, but it took the Met Police around 48 hours to actually locate this individual. He was in Finsbury Park with an avocado bag and still in his prison uniform. He was also spotted around Dalston Library, you'll recall, in CCTV on Friday night. But I think really this irks, and I'm sure Natasha will speak more about this, but with the government announcing all of these checks with regards to prison governors, a duty prison governor having to sign this off the day of, and also the governor sign it off the night before in terms of releasing someone to make sure this doesn't happen, and this review being done by the former Deputy Commissioner, Dame Lynn Owens, which, in terms of the timescale, it was reported it'd be a few months. You wonder if this will ramp up pressure for that to be, to come a lot quicker.
There are lots of questions here, aren't there? We'll come to Natasha in just a second on some of them as they affect politics. But how it happened, first of all, is about the prison standards. How the delay in telling the police happened, 5 days, 6 days, almost a week. When you think when it came to Kebatu, it was fairly short order that he was found in a city of millions. 2 days, as you say. But this is worse in a way, isn't it?
And it does seem extraordinary. It's interesting you say about the timeline, because it was on the Friday, wasn't it, that we learned that Hadush Kebatu had been released in error, and that was, it was broken by the Sun newspaper. But very soon afterwards, we'd heard from the government, we'd heard from the Metropolitan Police, and so everyone was aware. The fact
and any sighting pictures were out there all over social media.
And the thing I neglected to mention, by the way, is that the individual here, the Algerian man, was serving time for trespass with intent to steal, but has previously been convicted, it's understood, of sexual offences. So unclear as to whether he was in for that, but it seems it was for trespass with intent to steal. But nonetheless, it begs the question about another sex offender who's been on seemingly at large.
Thank you very much indeed, Henry. Henry Riley, LBC's reporter there with the latest. Our reporter Helen Hoddinott has headed down to Wandsworth. We'll hear from her in all likelihood this hour as well. Natasha, LBC's political editor. Where do you start? Why don't we start at PMQs? Because it was raised, and then before you know it, an answer came, but not from David Lammy.
Yeah, I think that's right, Sheila. And this is quite, crazy, really, that we are hearing about this news for the first time, because clearly the Conservative Party had got a tip-off before Prime Minister's questions that something was afoot, that something was underway, which is why James Cartledge chose to ask 5 out of 6 of his questions today about this. Here is a short exchange from Prime Minister's questions between James Cartledge, the Tory Shadow Defence Secretary, and David Lammy.
Can he reassure the House that since Kebatu was released, no other asylum-seeking offender has been accidentally let out of prison?
Deputy Prime Minister.
Well, the House is thankfully quiet, so I'm surprised the honourable gentleman didn't hear me when I said that of course I apologise and I'm sorry for the anxiety caused. But look, let me just remind him that he was a justice minister that allowed our prisons to get to this state in the first place. And it's now for us to fix the mess that we've got into. It's important that Dame Lynn Annals can now continue her work and understand what is happening. He knows that early release has begun under their watch in 2021.
Mr. Speaker, these are extremely serious crimes that we are talking about. I'm going to ask him the question again. Can he reassure the House that since Kebatu was released, no other asylum-seeking offender has been accidentally let out of prison? It's a very specific question for him to answer.
Deputy Prime Minister.
After his release, I put in place the toughest checks we've ever had in the prison system. It is important that Lynn Owens is able to get to the bottom of her work. I suspect there'll be more checks and balances we need to do.
So 5 times David Lammy, the Deputy Prime Minister and the Justice Secretary, did not answer the question from James Cartledge on whether there was something that he could tell us about whether any asylum seekers had been mistakenly released from prison. And as James and I were discussing on his show, obviously we know, and as Henry Riley's just been talking about, the numbers show that in the last year there have been around 262 people mistakenly released. So at first we were discussing, well, is there a possibility that maybe this is just he's taking a bit of a gamble, he's taking a little bit of a political punt and thinking, well, actually, if one's sort of been released every week or so, then, must have been a good chance that there may have been one more. However, in the last few minutes, of course, the news broke. This was the moment that an urgent question was then raised by James Cartledge in the House of Commons.
The Telegraph are reporting that a police manhunt has been launched for a second asylum seeker mistakenly freed from prison. The question is, Mr. Speaker, can you advise me on how I can ask the Justice Secretary whether he was aware of this when I asked him about it repeatedly in Prime Minister's question?
Do you want to? No. You put it on the record. Right, let's just move on.
Can I ask, did the Speaker say let's move on because he'd had his share of questions already?
Yes, so he'd had 6, and there was a little bit of a raucous in PMQs about whether he'd had his 6 allocations or not. Right. The Speaker was adamant that he had given him the 6 questions that he was already allocated.
Because he didn't give Lammy the responsibility of answering that final bit.
No, he didn't. So it seemed like either I wasn't obviously watching what was happening in the chamber, just listening to it. It seemed like James Cartledge just wanted to put that on the record that was an urgent question, but a point of order rather than an urgent question.
I see.
But that was a point of order to the Speaker rather than to David Lammy. So he was not obliged to answer it in the same way.
But it had an impact all the same.
Absolutely. And then, like I say, in the last sort of few minutes, we've had it confirmed that Downing Street have also not being able to say whether David Lammy knew about this mistakenly released prisoner when he 5 times refused to say so at DPMQs. So clearly they did know something. Clearly, David Lammy did know something. And as Henry has just been reporting, obviously, the Metropolitan Police were aware of this before this came. However, total radio silence from the government on this. We have not had a response from the Ministry of Justice, despite the fact that the Metropolitan Police have known this for at least 24 hours. That's quite shocking, I think, Sheila.
And so the government must have known it for at least...
Somebody in government must have known this. I find it extraordinary to think that somebody at the Ministry of Justice, and probably David Lammy, would have known this. And equally...
sat on it publicly.
Yeah, and obviously, like I say, the fact that this happens all the time, 262 in the last year. We don't hear about these mistakenly released prisoners. We only really heard about it because it was a tip to a newspaper and because of the high-profile nature
and the
of that
build-up
person.
around the Epping Bell and all of that.
Exactly, but you'd think that the government, after such a high-profile offender, it happened before, you'd think that they'd want the public's help, like they did with Kebatu, in releasing that information and releasing it to the press so that they could help track down this person. But obviously a week later we are now finding out this news, and really he could be anywhere by now.
Well, this is the thing, that whether it's an asylum seeker who's wrongly released or not,
it doesn't really matter, does it?
It's
about public safety.
Yeah,
exactly.
I mean, there's an extra layer of concern in terms of how our system is working when it comes to asylum seekers, but in terms of public safety, there's no difference.
I'm just surprised
transparency.
I'm surprised that Wandsworth Prison, that the Metropolitan Police do not feel that this is something that they are able to say on a regular basis
and engage the public with.
Yeah, and I just think that maybe they should. I think that maybe this should be something that should be sort of put out in the open when this does happen. But equally, if it's happening 262 times a year, you can understand why the Met don't want to release that information.
And Henry, just remind us, it was members of the public, wasn't it, who tipped off the police about Kebatu once he was out and roaming free?
Yes, and there was footage, of course, of him in Chelmsford town centre, which, I mean, it wasn't confirmed at the time to be him, but certainly looked very much like him. And I think that the instance there is that Hadush Kebatu was obviously notorious in the sense that he's sort of behind what happened in Epping and subsequently spread to the country. He was a very sort of infamous prisoner for obvious reasons. People knew his name, whereas we don't know the individual here, whether they are as high profile. But I think, as Natasha was saying, nonetheless, it's the key thing is the previous sexual offence that this individual has committed.
Just a thought, Natasha, before you go. Might this lead to a resignation question?
I don't think you can argue. I don't know, because if somebody has lied to the House, it's a different matter. The Tories might make the case that David Lammy has misled the House, because if it is indeed true that he did know about this and just did not answer the question by telling the truth about what he knew, they might be able to make that case.
I was actually
did he mislead the House of Commons by refusing to answer that question? There might be a case to answer that.
I was thinking less of the PMQ's moment and more of the week that has subsided, has passed, since this escape, and not one of us knew about it.
Yeah, I mean, there's questions to answer for the prison, for the Met Police and for the Ministry of Justice today.
Yeah.
And David Lammy will, have a strengthened case to argue by saying, I've put in place extra checks since I've become Justice Secretary. And that, we were discussing earlier, has been not hugely well received by the Prison Officers Association and other people working in prisons, because they say they believe the pendulum has then swung too far the other way. The onus is too far on them. But yes, I think you're absolutely right. There are questions about why this wasn't released, but like I say, this is just not information that is released to the public on a regular basis. But I think the question today, and certainly after this case, is should it be?